Welcome to my channel. Hit the like button, share, and subscribe. This is part 2 of Rick James. A poor or absent student with an early arrest record, young Rick was beginning what could have been an anonymous life of crime, incarceration, and drug use, followed by an early and mostly unnoticed death. His interest in music saved him. He liked sounds, his sister Camille Hudson says. Very, very early, he knew he wanted to be a musician. At home, Rick would be in the cupboards taking stuff out and beating on things. Or, as a later press release about Rick put it, at the age of 3, he first started creating rhythms on tin cans and bottles. While a student at East High School, Rick had taken advantage of extracurricular musical offerings by serving as a solo snare drummer and playing conga drums and bongos with the Brown Cadet Corps, an all-black marching band. He also studied the trombone and the bass guitar at school and sang on street corners with a group of friends he called the Duprees. After dropping out of East High School, Rick spent a lot of time at the African American Cultural Center in Buffalo playing conga drums, learning Swahili, chanting, and hanging around other young people interested in music. His participation in the center's programs resulted in one of his first solo performances as a singer. Malcolm Ernie, the head of the center, was so impressed by Rick's ability to perform African chants that he took Rick to Chicago to perform them there. As Rick's interest in music increased, he adopted a pattern that did not vary for the rest of his life. Rather than become a specialist on any one instrument, he learned just enough about several to be competent on them. He wasn't a great bass player, but he could play what he could play as good as most people, Leroy Johnson notes. Then he learned a little bit about singing and went on from there. Although Rick would occasionally boast about being a great instrumentalist, no musician who heard him play any instrument for more than a couple minutes ever believed him. People talked about Rick's ability to play instruments, but Rick couldn't play worth shit, Levi Ruffin says. Percussion, yes, and he could work out a song on a guitar. He could even mess around on the bass and figure it out, but he could never really finish it. He could sit there and figure it out, but as far as him playing, oh my God, oh hell no. I wouldn't hire him to play anything. Rick wrote in his 2007 autobiography, The Confessions of Rick James, Memoirs of a Super Freak, that he never had confidence in his own playing and that he didn't want to be constricted as a performer by being tied to an instrument. Leroy Johnson says that what Rick was trying to do was put together just enough of what was needed to be a star. The varied musical knowledge Rick obtained by dabbling with different instruments enabled him to pick out good musicians and direct and produce them knowledgeably in the groups he would form and direct during his career. Many of these groups backed him on stage or on records, and then went on to perform on their own with him as their producer. Ruffin notes, however, that Rick did work hard on developing his voice, and for a reason. Rick realized when we were young that the guys that get most of the broads were the singers, he says. He also characterizes Rick's voice as rough and powerful. It had that dirt on it, that edge on it, he says. To this day, I don't know how Rick could sing like that. Rick's early musical talent, his attempt to learn all the parts of a song, both vocal and instrumental, his work on his own voice, and his flexible ethics came together one day in 1961 when Rick and Leroy, then in their early teens, heard of an upcoming talent show at the Carpenters Hall in Buffalo. Although the contestants had already been chosen, Leroy says, Rick lied to the organizers, insisting his name had been on the list and he had been eliminated by mistake. When Rick went on stage, he performed the then popular song, but showing either his naivety or his versatility and understanding of different musical roles, sang both the background and the lead parts himself. Johnson saw this performance as a joke and was laughing under his breath. But the judges were so impressed, they awarded Rick second place in the competition. This was one of several local talent shows in which he did well. Possibly referring to this talent show, Rick told Rolling Stone years later that the feeling of the crowd singing, the people dancing in the aisles, cast a magic spell on me. I made a pact with myself from that day on. Music was my life. A short time after that talent show, Johnson said, Rick wrote a song called Dorinda, a tribute to his real high school girlfriend of that name. Under the name Melinda, it would be recorded and released by the Motown group Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers in 1968. Rick's professional musical career was on its way. No one who knew Rick James as a hyperactive kid with an early arrest record would have thought of him as a great material for the U.S. military. I was a juvenile delinquent, Rick told one TV interviewer years later about his life as a kid in Buffalo. I was crying out for attention. Unfortunately for Rick, by dropping out of high school, not going to college, not marrying, and not producing any dependents, he became a prime candidate for the U.S. military draft, which had begun in 1940 and would last until 1973. It was Malcolm Ernie, the head of Buffalo's African American Cultural Center, who suggested Rick join the U.S. Navy to avoid being drafted into the U.S. Army, the fate of many young men of that era. If Rick joined the Navy, Ernie told him, he could fulfill his military obligation merely by attending 2 weekend drills a month at a site near his house, and he would never have to become a full-time sailor. He'd also get paid and be able to return to high school if he wished. Rick also might have been influenced by the fact that his father had served in the Navy. He was certainly influenced by a neighbor named Jerry Long, who wanted to be in the Navy, and who signed up at the same time as Rick. Rick might have done well in the Navy and avoided combat service if he'd actually attended most of the drills and obeyed an order or two. But anyone who examined his school record could have predicted the chances of his doing that were less than zero. His sister, Camille Hudson, says she was surprised when Rick joined up because I didn't see him following anybody's instructions for more than 5 minutes. She was amazed that he even lasted a couple of months in the military. You could tell him to go upstairs and he'd go downstairs, just to disobey, she said. Nevertheless, Rick joined the U.S. Naval Reserve on February 18, 1964 for a 6-year stint. He was 16 years old. The Navy allowed volunteers to join at 17 with parental permission, but no one younger was allowed to join. Rick and his mother lied about his age to get him into the service, and Rick backed it up by borrowing a birth certificate from a man named James Johnson, who was older than he was. Rick's mother knew what her child was like, of course, but as Leroy Johnson said in 2013, she would sign any paper to get him out of the house. My mother had a thing that if you were 15 years old, you were grown, which would never be what any of us as parents would do right now. Naval Lieutenant Dan Bruggeman, who was involved in one of Rick's court-martials, put this in a slightly different way. These were street kids, he says. Nobody wanted them around. They wanted to try being in the military, and the parents said, "Fine, get out of here." Rick soon began skipping his required twice-monthly weekend drills. After about 6 months of such behavior, Rick was ordered to spend 45 continuous training days at Naval Station Great Lakes near Chicago, the Navy's only boot camp. He managed to survive his time there, but once released, he began missing drills once again. Exasperated, Navy superiors ordered Rick to report for full-time duty as a crew member on the USS Enterprise, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that was on its way to the waters off Vietnam. Only in the military would such a poor performer be ordered to continue his poor performance aboard a nuclear aircraft carrier. Rick left Buffalo to report to the Enterprise, but changed his mind in Rochester, New York, and instead climbed aboard a bus for Toronto, Canada. He had become a U.S. Navy deserter.